I'm really sincerely honored to have been chosen for this and for that great introduction. Thank you so much, Professor Huttner. All right, so I'm going to just get started. I hope everybody could see everything. As a kind of preface, I want to say that English Mariology, or the theology of Mary, makes up actually just a very small part of my dissertation, which is about motherhood and spiritual crisis in the 18th century. As scholars have noted, 18th century literary culture became enamored of the concept of full-time effective motherhood. Dramatizing the polemics of Mary Estelle, works by Daniel Defoe and Samuel Richardson, to name a couple, contain numerous references to biblical matriarchs. Niobe, I'm going to, one of my devices. The classical figure of Niobe materializes in pictures, such as this one by Richard Wilson in 1760. She sobs in poems. But explicit references to the Virgin Mary are extremely difficult to find. This at first did not surprise me before I did the research. Conventional wisdom on the figure of Mary is that she was a victim of the iconoclasm of the English Reformation. Her status as an object of cult worship meant that she was a dangerously Catholic figure that recalled an idolatrous past. And Mary's eternal virginity did not square with the post-Reformation imperative for women to marry, breed, and have quivers full of children. This is an important part of Marian history, to be sure, but it's also typical of what Charles Taylor calls in a secular age, quote, subtraction theories. And I'm going to, oops. All right, I've written this up a little bit so that you can kind of follow some of this theoretical stuff here. These are theories about secularization, normally beginning in the 18th century with the Age of Enlightenment, that posit a gradual decline or receding of religious forms and practices from public life, culminating in a society in which it is possible for citizens to function without sustained confrontation with religious groups. Habermas's concept of the post-secular is in many ways a culmination of the secularism thesis, which has dominated literary and cultural history since the secular turn in academic studies. It's based in the perception that there is now a new imperative to engage with religion and belief in the public sphere. New histories of the 18th and 19th centuries have questioned the prior existence of the secular state and the terms under which it can or has ever existed. In 18th century scholarship, it's become necessary for scholars not only to reassess the importance of religious faith and institutions in Enlightenment society, but also to remain mindful of the critical attitudes of our forebears that made the belief in widespread secularization not only possible, but inevitable. These include an emphasis on philosophical history, an equation of modernity with secularity, a focus on the institutional definitions of religion, such as religion equals church, religion equals religious groups, and an ideological distaste for religion amongst the academic elite. The post-secular in literary and cultural studies is a state in which it's no longer possible not to engage with the role of religion, and where the historiographical eschatology of secularism becomes highly suspect. In other words, it's become necessary to look at the ways in which religious belief continued to survive and readjust its hold on society. It's in this spirit that I return to the role of Mary in English devotional and theological texts at the turn of the 18th century. Because I think that her re-Disappearance, as my title says, at that time suggests something more complex going on than that the tide of disenchantment simply swept her away. Before I do that, though, I think I want to introduce another context that bridges some of these concepts into the 20th century. On June 30th, 2014, as everybody knows, Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood Specialties won a United States Supreme Court case against Health and Human Services. In what Ruth Bader Ginsburg called a decision of startling breadth, the court ruled that a, quote, closely held corporation with, quote, sincere Christian beliefs about contraception was entitled to protection as an individual under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which I'll call RFRA for this brief part of my talk. The RFRA from 1993 reintroduced strict scrutiny in determining whether a religiously neutral law impedes the free exercise of religion. The SCOTUS case therefore focused on whether a for-profit corporation could be sincerely religious, not whether it could impose those beliefs on its employees, not whether its objection to contraception coverage amounted to sex discrimination, but whether a retail chain could be, quote, religious, or whether it was, quote, secular. Following this train of thought, activists and commentators took to debating the secularism of the corporations, usually equating secularism and for-profit. A few examples, I'm just going to give a very few, because I think I'm more interested in the national conversation than what the court case was about. R.H. Reality Check suggested, rather tautologically, that a secular for-profit company could not be a religious individual. Catholic Bishop James Conley characterized the case as part of the battle against the cultural leitmotif of secularism. And the American Conservative argued that Hobby Lobby is, quote, a significant player in the global economy that has separated markets from morality, unquote, and therefore operates in, quote, a decisively secular world, which was sort of surprising to me to read in that publication, but that is what they said. But when one considers that Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wagons managed to redefine abortion from terminating pregnancy to preventing implantation, and then to object to that newly defined prospect on religious grounds, and then to operate in the public sphere based on that new objection, it seems that referring to these entities as secular leaves quite a bit unsaid. The court's decision allows them to function as what Habermas calls, quote, communities of interpretation, interpreting as coterminous their rights as both secular corporations and religious individuals. This has had two important effects. The first is to burst the perception of divergent societal bubbles with which many Americans have become comfortable, the religious sphere and the political sphere. The second is to empower religious communities to use the corporate form to further a bioethical agenda with an extended reach. The national conversation around Hobby Lobby has been one in which the discourse of religious freedom confounds and often masks issues of empowerment. When we talk about the line separating positive and negative freedoms, freedom to and freedom from, we're inevitably talking about power. When the circuitous flow of money, which is a term that Carol Jackson, a lower court judge, used in regards to this case, becomes a stream of power, that power inevitably extends to the bodies of individuals, as is the case for service women abroad who are prohibited abortions, or corporate employees whose insurance does not cover an IUD. Such restrictions fix women in the role of mother and subject them to state or corporate powers in the name of freedom. Rarely is this confrontation between the rhetoric of freedom and the exercise of power more apparent than it is in the case of women in reproduction. In the late 17th century, the patriarchal impulse to control women through motherhood faced a pesky counterpoint in religious feminism. Feminists asserted public power through their demand for religious freedom. Early English feminists such as Mary Astle, or Estelle, which I might call her through this, Margaret Fell, and M. Marson developed a hermeneutics of the Bible in support of women's freedom of conscience that legitimized empowerment of women as parents and religious leaders. I would like to posit that it is in the midst of this development that the Virgin Mary finally disappeared from English literary culture. 17th century theologians touted the Virgin Mary as a figure of blameless suffering and voluntary submission. She became part of a currency of patriarchy and orthodoxy, and as such neither inspired religious feminists nor the more complex 18th century discourse of motherhood to which these feminist speculations gave rise. As my title suggests, after her burial under the polemics of the Reformation, the figure of Mary had a brief revival in Anglican theology and Tractarian controversy. When she finally re-disappeared, it is because the concerns that religious feminism raised about motherhood, female subjectivity, and freedom of conscience had taken a greater hold on the public imagination than a static image of maternal virtue or debates about the carnality of Christ. So I want to show you this engram viewer, which is not evidence in itself, but it is a kind of good visual of my research and the research of others like Hilda Grafe, who did a pretty exhaustive history of Marian theology, and Christine Peters. And what it shows you is that the references to Mary in English publications between 1600 and 1800 sort of peaked, let's see, oh, it works, all right, sort of peaked here around the 1700 mark. And I'm going to explain what people were talking about at that time. As I move into the second part of my talk, I'll briefly explore some of the major discussions of Mary that created this small spike, and later the ways in which religious feminists construed their capacity for maternity as a kind of public political power. During the Reformation, Protestant theologians preached a return to Christ as the sole figure of devotion. They issued polemics against the veneration of saints and the Virgin Mary, not incidentally corrupting away a source of empowerment for some women who chose a life of devotion. The Reformers' view of Mary tended to stress both her ordinariness and her personal sinlessness. Early debate centered on the problem of her permanent virginity, that is, whether she could maintain a hymen after giving birth. The superficial quaintness of this debate notwithstanding, the question had significant bearing on the carnality of Christ, who received his status as man from the humanity of her mother. As a human, she would have to lose her hymen. But if she lost her hymen, was she still a virgin? Right, so this was a really important question that they were debating. But it seemed to occupy the entire question of Mary for a good deal of the time. Reformation theologians, despite the importance of this question, increasingly contrived reasons to despise the Virgin Mary and erase her from religious contemplation. So it became a sort of very cerebral argument they were having and not an object of contemplation or of devotion. Post-Reformation divines were careful to interpret the Magnificat, or the Song of Mary, as an example of her humility. In their interpretation of Luke, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee," they emphasized Mary's surprise at the expression "hail" being used to one like herself that was so lowly. The hermeneutics of humility were one of the ways in which they attempted to undo Mary's Roman Catholic elevation. Martin Luther, perhaps her biggest enemy, identified a sanction to disregard Mary in John 2:3, when at Cana Mary called for more wine and Christ refused her. Overall, Reformation polemics stressed that the focus of the Christian devotee should be with the Son and not the Mother. In the mid-17th century, in the emergence of high Anglicanism, discussions of Mary took the tone of recovery projects. Many of these recovery-minded tracts were published or reprinted after the Restoration in the later Stuart period, around 1700. In the 17th century, Anglicans revived interest in Mary and her personal holiness, stressing her importance as a model for English mothers and women in general. Mark Frank, who was the treasurer of Pembroke College and lost his office during the Puritan interregnum, advocated for an exalted place for Mary, lamenting that, quote, "Our Lord is wounded through Our Lady's sides. Because the Romans make little less of her than a god, they make not so much of her as a good woman," unquote. Frank's sermons were printed in 1679 at a time when contemplation of Mary was somewhat less controversial than it was during his lifetime. Anglican Mariology emphasized effective, submissive motherhood, and it united soul and womb, or breast. Often it renders the virgin birth an act of the highest form of charity. Through birth and maternal care, Mary avails herself of the nearest possible relationship to Christ, which allows her all contradictory female virtues at once, virgin, mother, and spouse. Anthony Stafford's 1635, The Female Glory, or the Life and Death of Our Blessed Lady, stresses her spousal obedience. Quote, "She understood that consent was not only required to be the parent of the Almighty, but the spouse also of the Holy Spirit," unquote. Mary's wifely duty was to yield Christ up to persecution and lastly death on the cross. Thomas Tennyson, in a sermon concerning doing good to posterity, conjures the faithful to revere Mary as a mother and provider of eternal charity through breastfeeding. Breastfeeding was very much connected to charity in a lot of these tracts. Says Mary has a special favor of God, Completing her maternal perfection is her unthreatening humility and servitude, which Anglican churchmen unabashedly offered as a model for English women. Jeremy Taylor, in The Life of Our Blessed Lord and Savior, also reminds us that the desire of becoming a mother to the Messiah were great in all the daughters of Jacob. I'm going to put up a quote from Jeremy Taylor, which I'll read in a second. And that Mary rejoiced to be the mother of that Messiah so that she, quote, might with better advantage be his servant. During the birth, he says, that the angels were the ministers, the Holy Virgin was the worshiper, and Christ was the deity. The worshiper's reward is motherhood, but sacrifice is required should the deity call for it, which of course he does. Though English women could no longer, like the matriarchs, hope to become the mother of Christ in penance for original sin, they could still strive to be like her in following a codified program of motherhood that was easily contained by gender hierarchies. In some cases, as in this case, the Anglican Mariology has really very little to differentiate it from things like George Seville's conduct book, which he wrote to his, and of course some of you might know that a conduct book throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th century are these books that explain what female behavior should be like. Not always female, but mainly, all right? So what he says about Mary, that collecting how she lived in contemplation, isolated away from people, and that's why she was disposed to this heavenly visitation. We see again and again, George Seville, Halifax, Wettenhall Wilkes, throughout the 18th century, this language comes up, is this sort of very, very popular amongst churchmen who love to write conduct books. Nobody liked to write conduct books more than churchmen. Right, so these familial configurations put masculine authority in the position of the unquestionable, if opaque, spiritual leader of the household. By analogy, they made the husband a god in his home. Mary, in the Anglican contemplation of her, is made spiritually and politically orthodox, a fully human but fully pure, obedient subject. Now, Anglicans were not the only religious group to resuscitate Mary as an exemplar to women in piety and obedience. The dissenter John Bunyan, The dissenter John Bunyan wrote a second part to the Pilgrim's Progress, which is not very frequently, as frequently read as the first part. It depicts the progress of Christiana's wife. So readers of Bunyan might remember that she refused to join him when he left and said, "What shall I do to be saved?" and went running into the pit of despond. She stayed home with the children. In this sequel, she fears that she's damned them all, including herself and her children, so she goes to follow Christian. The sequel involves Christiana in a series of conversations wherein her maternal behavior is interpreted, judged, and ultimately redeemed in an arrangement that subordinates her maternal authority to values of obedience. And I love this print because it really, this is from the 1728 edition. My students might remember this edition because I showed it to you. And we see right at the head, Christian's not there anymore. He's gone. He's off to heaven. And this is Greatheart, who we know is one that is weak in grace, but he has a strong heart, right? And he's leading them. So they've had to replace Christian in a way because the women can't be by themselves. And you have Christiana here, but Greatheart at the head of the table. And this is Christiana's children, and this is their host, right? So she's not at the head of the table, and he's not at the head of the table. And this configuration really shows the way throughout the second part of the Pilgrim's Progress, how the single mother, right, what we would call now the single mother, has to be brought back into a traditional family arrangement by bringing all these male agents in. But speaking specifically about Mary, Bunyan has the innkeeper Gaius speak in defense of women or on behalf of women. And he says, "As death and curse came into the world by a woman, so also did life and health. God sent forth his Son made of woman. Yea, to show how much those that came after did abhor the act of their mother, this sex in the Old Testament coveted children, if happily this or that woman might be the mother of the Savior of the world." Old Testament matriarchs connect to and serve the deity through motherhood. So you remember Sarah is rewarded with motherhood, and Rachel is rewarded with motherhood. Through motherhood and with children, they're rewarded by the deity. Gaius's defense reifies a program wherein maternity is coveted, but the mother, Eve, is hated. The woman participates in both eternal reprobation, being mother, and salvation, accepting and performing motherhood. She desires children in hopes that she may resemble the mother that is loved, Mary, instead of the mother that is hated, which would be Eve. Mary is not so much a conduit or proxy to God, but what Christine Peters calls, quote, a pattern of piety, an alternative to ignominious disobedience. Mary thus become a sort of currency for Orthodox female behavior. The Orthodox reading of Paul's epistles meant that women were supposed to be silent and submissive, that the man was the head of the woman, and that Paul's interpretation of Genesis sanctioned male hegemony. This is, as I will discuss, an Orthodox reading that religious feminists did not subscribe to. The theology of Mary also had another use in sectarian controversy, of which anti-Quaker polemic provides us a good example. It also accounts for the increased interest in Mary in the early 18th century, because that's about the time when anti-Quaker polemic hit its height. The former Quaker leader, George Keith, left the Society of Friends in 1691 and was ordained an Anglican minister in 1702. Keith had argued that the Quakers had run too far afield of Orthodox Christianity, engaged in high-profile battles with colonial Quakers, and thus become a useful figure to Anglicans who saw dissent as a threat to the power of the national church. The transatlantic Keithian schism, as it's called, prompted a flood of tracts on either side. Anglicans accused Quakers of ignoring the scriptures in favor of their own inner light or meditations, denying the carnality of Christ, and generally sowing religious error in England and abroad. Quaker belief in a distinction between the divine substance with which believers participate and the body of Christ prompted accusations that they denied the virgin birth and the Apostles' Creed. Quakers responded by asserting their positive assent to the creed and to belief in Mary's virginity, even though they separated the carnal Christ, which comes from Mary, and the Spirit, which comes from heaven. These tracts used Keith's own words against him, and many of them were reprints or first issues of the works of famous late Quakers like Elizabeth Bathurst, put out by printers like Tacy Soule in response to Keith's conversion. And this was kind of important to the Quakers because the Quakers believed that the patriarchs were also saved by participation with the divine Spirit, even though Christ had not been born yet, right, and hadn't died yet. So that's why this issue came up. But it was also a very political issue. George Keith went from being a very outspoken Quaker to a very outspoken Anglican over the course of about 10 years. And that really fueled the high church Tories at the time. At the turn of the 18th century, an assent to belief in the Virgin Mary was in many ways a confession of orthodoxy. Particularly for the Quakers, the affirmation of the virgin birth was a kind of shorthand that said, we are towing the line. Towing the line, of course, is not what early religious feminists were about. On the contrary, they developed an alternative biblical hermeneutics of women's freedom of conscience and direct connection to the deity. Emphasizing women's right to speak and to teach, writers including Elizabeth Bathurst, Margaret Fell, M. Marson, and Mary Estelle preferred to represent pious womanhood with litanies of biblical figures: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Ruth, Deborah, Esther, Elizabeth, Judith, of which the Virgin Mary was only one amongst many. Unlike their Orthodox Anglican counterparts, they did not meditate complacently on a single impossible and overdetermined standard. In her essay, In Spite of the Times, Rosie Braidotti posits a reevaluation of political subjectivity out of feminist criticism's engagement with the post-secular. She says, quote, subjectivity is rather a process of ontology, of autopoiesis or self-styling, which involves complex and continuous negotiations with dominant norms and values, constructed through micro-political practices. This definition is useful for understanding the ways in which early English feminists made radical interventions via a series of small negotiations and fashioned for themselves a positively religious subjectivity. As a community of interpretation, they expanded the possibilities for women's typological identification. As I move into the third and final part of my talk, I'll explain some of the techniques of religious feminists and their writing in the period. This is when I get to show them off. Okay. So, Margaret Fell, who was a founder of the Society of Friends, or the Quakers, published Women's Speaking Justified in 1666. This tract argues against the error of prohibiting women's speech on religious matters with a seemingly interminable list of prophetic women. She says, "You are so far from the minds of the elders of Israel who praised God for women's speaking." With regard to the New Testament, she focuses especially on the women Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, who brought news of the resurrection. Arguing from Revelation, she says that God has put enmity between the woman and the serpent. Fell's method is to bring in a preponderance of scriptural evidence for the prophetic and didactic talents of women. Elizabeth Bathurst uses this method also of listing biblical types as evidence that, quote, women receive an office of truth as well as men. And this method becomes all too familiar to patriarchal apologists who scoff in satires and novels at such references, at such lists, right? Don't talk to me of your Sarahs and your Rachels. And so, whereas opponents of women's religious authority point very specifically to Genesis 3 and the epistles of Paul in order to silence and disempower women, feminist writing in the period points to the errors in their points to these as errors and a simplistic and incomplete exegesis. Margaret Fell and the dissenting writer known to us only as M. Marson, some people think it's Mary, but there's no real way to know, decry this tendency to read Paul's epistles with an anti-woman bias. Fell argues that Paul's command for women to keep silent applies only to worldly women attempting to exert authority over their husbands, not to the godly. And that men are commanded to keep silence as well. She says, quote, "The man is committed to keep silence as well as the woman when they are in confusion and out of order." Marson attributes the bias against women's speech to a continuing benighted-ness of exegetes who have still not fully emerged from the darkness of the Roman Church. In the Women's Advocate, always going the wrong way, that's Bathurst. And we have to see pictures of their books. There are no, for most of these people, there are no portraits drawn. All right. Marson in many places compares herself, oh, sorry, I skipped a little bit. In the Women's Advocate, she says, quote, "We are now in great mistakes, having lost in several places the right sentiments of the word," unquote. And that's through the, before the Reformation. She says, you can't expect that within 100 years we've undone all of these mistakes that we've made when we were Catholics. And in particular, she reintroduces different words of Paul in Galatians 3:28, where he says, "There is neither bond or free, male nor female, for they are all one in Jesus Christ." Right? So they come up with these large bodies of evidence rather than sort of just belaboring one or two things that are supposed to say women should be quiet. Marson in many places compares herself to the Virgin Mary, but not as a mother in the bodily sense. Her identification with the Virgin is through Marson's sense of herself as being full of Christ and bringing, through her testimony, Christ into the world. Her speech has a particularly apocalyptic resonance. She believed that that the world was going to end and that a woman would be just as capable of bringing that news, and that if people wouldn't listen, that they would be damned. She warns men that they ignore female prophets at their peril and says, quote, "I hope that as a man is willing to be saved by the Lord of life that came of a woman, that they will not rather choose to go hoodwinked to destruction than to be warned by a woman of the approaching danger," unquote. Thus, like Fell, Marson works with types that underscore women's righteous outspokenness. The virgin birth she interprets figuratively as a form of inspired speech, freeing it from its domestic context in which women were bound by a literal performance of motherhood. Mary Estelle, there's Elizabeth Bathurst again, okay. Mary Estelle stands apart from her sister theologians in the sense that she is not a dissenter, but a high church conservative Anglican with strong loyalist Tory sentiments. And she begins her interventions on behalf of women's freedom of conscience by criticizing the hypocrisy of Locke's contractarian theory. And famously, we know, she says, if all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? Astell was an admirer of Jeremy Taylor as well. Therefore, she adopts many of the strategies of the other feminist writers, but she approaches her Anglican brethren with more subtlety. Rather than charging them with benightedness, she suggests that the practice of keeping women in ignorance resonates with Roman Catholicism in other ways, right? Using scriptural examples, Astell argues that the relationship of biblical women to the deity was often forged by maternal behavior that eschewed the commands of patriarchs, and that their judgment was in many instances superior to that of men. She spends a lot of time talking about Rebecca, much, much more time than she spends talking about the Virgin Mary. The maternal and spiritual duty to God in Astell's work is of a higher order than the secular duty to husbands, which too often impedes religious duty. She says here it might be any man's, just as it might be any man's duty to keep hogs, right? Is how you can sort of make sense of a woman's duty to her husband. Taken together, Mary Astell's A Serious Proposal and Reflections Upon Marriage establish a gendered discourse of secularism and spirituality while offering and exemplifying an alternative to traditional male authority. Characterizing men in general as having become distinctly or discursively secular, she dismantles their claim to mediating authority and posits herself instead, or a school, right? Such as the one that she suggests in A Serious Proposal to the Ladies. In A Serious Proposal, she focuses on improving the spiritual condition of women capable of the loftiest heights of piety by preparing their understandings to receive religious truths firsthand, as opposed to mediated through the learning of men. Similarly, Reflections on Marriage highlights the secular tyranny of marriage. In elevating examples of biblical matriarchs over the misogynist orthodox interpretation of the Pauline epistles, work that Locke had begun in his first treatise on government, Astell capitalizes on the subversive potential of contractualist hermeneutics. In her preface to the Revised Edition, she tears a foundational rift between filial and spiritual duty. And that's the quote that she says here, which I've already said. When she does talk about the Virgin Mary, she says only that she received the greatest honor that human nature is capable of. This is Astell's brief reference to the Virgin in Reflections Upon Marriage. Just one of many New Testament women, the Virgin in Astell's estimation is noted as an example of divine sanction of female agency, not as a model for conduct nor obedience. I'd like to conclude with Astell's manuscript poem in emulation of Cowley. She laments that the conditions under which female speech is appraised and constrained allow her only two options in the performance of her faith, either motherhood or silent prayer. Through specularity, rather than speech, she might communicate the piety with which she is inflamed, right? Yet by good example, she can always preach. But it is interesting, this is a private devotion. It's rather uncharacteristic of Astell in its interiority, but it's interesting in the ways in which it expresses concisely the relegation of women to private stages of performance. She categorically rejects the heights of Mary's privilege as a thing she cannot even desire, right? Nor does she have a claim, as Marcion does, on the opportunity of identifying with Mary through speech. So it's a kind of depressing end to this talk to show this poem. But when you consider all of the writing that she did and how far its reach has been, I think it's pretty important to see the way that she finally jettisons Mary. She says, you know, we can't even wish for that. We can't think about that. It's not an appropriate model. The interpretive strategies of early religious feminists reflect religious subjectivities struggling to be heard amidst what might have seemed like an impossible din. But what we know is that they were in fact heard, especially by those who, in the century that followed, set the standard for fiction writing. If, as Nancy Armstrong argues in Desire in Domestic Fiction, the first modern subject was a female subject, then the models for those subjects were almost certainly women like Fell, Bathurst, Mason, and Marcion, who asserted a religious identity apart from the codifications of Orthodox Christianity. The Virgin Mary was, in one sense, a sacrifice to their legacy, jettisoned because she could no longer legitimize women's religious or political agency. In another sense, however, she survived as a fugitive embedded in every insistence of 18th century women to be heard.